human soul's capacity to love and their relationship to the elemental world. When the soul consciously enters the elemental world, it finds itself forced to change many of the ideas gained in the sensory world. If you have strengthened the soul's powers appropriately, you will be able to make such changes. Indeed, you must attain that strength of soul and not shy away from doing so. Otherwise, when you enter the elemental world, you will be overwhelmed by the feeling that you are losing the solid ground the solid ground needed to build up will in your inner life. Unless you hold on to them as tightly as you did when you gained them, the ideas you gained in the physical sensory world will not impede your entry into the elemental world. You cling to these ideas only because your soul has the habit of doing so. For a consciousness that initially experienced only the sensory world, it is completely natural that it should become accustomed to taking the form of ideas developed there as the only one possible. In fact, it is more than natural. It is necessary. The life of the soul would never achieve the inner unity and the stability it needed if it did not develop its consciousness in a sensory world ruled by fixed and necessary ideas. Everything given to the soul by living in the sensory world aids it in entering the elemental world without losing its independent, self-contained, and stable nature. We must therefore strengthen and empower our soul life. Then, when the soul enters the elemental world, its independence is not held unconsciously, but is held clearly and consciously. If the soul is too weak to experience the elemental world consciously, then when it enters that world, its independence disappears, just as a thought disappears when impressed so feebly on the soul that it does not live on in the memory. A weak soul of this kind cannot enter the suprasensory world consciously. Each time a weak soul tries to enter the suprasensory world, the being in the soul, whom we call the guardian of the threshold, throws it back into the sensory world. And if, in the attempt, the soul gets a taste of the suprasensory world that it still remembers after sinking back into the sensory world, then this prize from another realm can confuse its thinking. It is, however, quite impossible to fall into such confusion if one cultivates the kind of healthy power of judgment that can be acquired in the sensory world. By strengthening our powers of judgment, we develop the soul's proper relationship to the processes and beings of the suprasensory worlds. To live in those worlds consciously, the soul must possess a natural tendency that it cannot develop as fully in the sensory world as it can in the suprasensory worlds. This tendency is unreserved devotion to what you experience. You must dive down into experience and be able to unite with it. And you must be able to do that to such a degree that you see yourself outside your own nature and feel yourself within another. Your own being must transform into the one you are experiencing. Without this capacity for transformation, you cannot experience anything genuine in the suprasensory worlds. For the basis of all experience in the suprasensory worlds is the conscious knowledge that says, "Now I have transformed myself in a particular way. I am united vitally with another being whose nature has thus transformed me." To transform yourself in this way, to feel yourself into another being, is to live in the suprasensory worlds. You come to know the beings and processes of those worlds. You notice that how you relate to a particular being is especially dependent upon how close its nature is to your own. Distinct shades of experience arise that, especially in the elemental world, one could characterize as sympathy and antipathy. For instance, when meeting an elemental being or process, you may feel a sympathetic experience arising in your soul. Through this experience of sympathy, you come to understand the nature of that being or process. Do not imagine, however, that these experiences of sympathy or antipathy differ only in strength or degree of intensity. In the physical world, you may indeed speak of experiences of sympathy and antipathy as being only stronger or weaker. But in the elemental world, you can differentiate sympathies and antipathies not simply by their strength, but also by their color. Just as you experience the sensory world as many-colored, likewise will you experience the elemental world as manifoldly sympathetic and antipathetic. Here we must remember, too, that in the realm of elemental beings, antipathetic does not connote that we inwardly turn away from something. Antipathetic simply refers a characteristic of an elemental being or process that relates to a sympathetic characteristic of another process or being, as the color blue relates to red in the sensory world. We can speak of a sense that people can awaken in their etheric bodies for seeing the elemental world. That sense can perceive sympathies and antipathies in the elemental world, just as the eye, EYE, perceives colors, or the ear tones in the sensory world. Just as in the sensory world one object is red and another blue, to spiritual sight some beings of the elemental world radiate a kind of sympathy and others a kind of antipathy. This experience of the elemental world through sympathy and antipathy, again, does not occur only to the supersensibly awakened soul. It is always present in every human soul. It belongs to the nature of the human soul. In ordinary life, however, knowledge of this part of human nature is not developed. People have within them an etheric body, and this connects them in hundreds of ways with the beings and processes of the elemental world. At one moment we are interwoven with certain sympathies and antipathies in the elemental world, and at another moment with others. The soul cannot live constantly as an etheric being, and so the sympathies and antipathies are not always active in the elemental world in a clearly articulated way. In sensory existence, the states of waking and sleeping must alternate. Likewise, in the elemental world, the soul's experience of sympathies and antipathies must have an opposite state. The soul can withdraw from all sympathies and antipathies and inwardly experience only itself. That is, it can consider and feel only its own being. That feeling of self-being may become so intense that we can speak of willing our own being. The state of the soul in its own pure original nature is not easily portrayed. Other than the soul's strong, pure sense of self, or capital I feeling, there is nothing like it in the sensory world. Indeed, we can describe that state as it is experienced in the elemental world only by saying that the soul's necessary devotion to experiences of sympathy and antipathy causes it to feel the urge to say to itself, I will be wholly for me. I will be only in me. Only by a kind of unfolding of the will can the soul wrench itself from its state of unreserved devotion to the experiences of sympathy and antipathy in the elemental world. In the elemental world, this living in oneself is like the state of sleep, whereas devotion to processes and beings corresponds to the waking state. If the human soul is awake in the elemental world and develops the will to experience itself, that is, if it feels a need for elemental sleep, it can achieve that self-experience by returning to the waking state of sensory life with a fully developed feeling of self. For when saturated by the feeling of self, the experience of the sensory world is nothing other than elemental sleep. It is the freeing of the soul from elemental experiences. It is literally true to say that for suprasensory consciousness, the life of the soul in the sensory world is a spiritual sleep. A person who, having developed spiritual vision in the right way, awakens in the suprasensory world will retain the memory of soul experiences in the sensory world. If you did not retain that memory, other beings and processes would be present in your clairvoyant consciousness, but your own being would not. You would then have no knowledge of yourself. You yourself would not live spiritually, but other beings and processes would live in your soul. Thinking this through, you will understand why a properly developed clairvoyant must place significant value upon developing a strong capital I feeling. The I feeling, developed in connection with clairvoyance, certainly does not first come about through clairvoyance. Clairvoyance simply helps us learn to recognize what was always present in the depths of our soul, but remained unconscious for ordinary sensory life. Strong I feeling comes about not through the etheric body, but through the soul's experience of the physical sensory body. If the soul does not bring this I feeling, developed through its experiences in the sensory world, into the clairvoyant state, it will soon become evident that the soul is inadequately prepared for the experience of the elemental world. But an essential characteristic of human consciousness in the sensory world requires that the soul's self-feeling, its I experience, though present, be muted. This gives the soul the opportunity to experience in the sensory world training in the noblest moral force, compassion. If a strong sense of self were to dominate the soul's conscious experiences in the sensory world, then moral instincts and ideas could not develop properly. They could not bring forth the fruit that is love. Devotion, a natural impulse in the elemental world, is not the same as what we call love in normal human experience. Elemental devotion is based on an experience of oneself in another being or process. Love is an experience of the other in one's own soul. To experience love, however, a sort of veil must be drawn in the soul over the self-feeling or I experience present in its depths. Then, because its own powers are muted, the joys and sorrows of the other arise in the soul. In this way, love, which is the source of the most genuine moral impulse in human life, germinates. Love is for us the most important fruit of human experience in the sensory world. If you penetrate the nature of love, or compassion, you will discover how the spiritual expresses its truth in the sensory world. I have already said that it is in the nature of the suprasensory to transform itself into something else. If the spiritual in physical human life transforms itself in such a way that the sense of self is muted and then rises up as love, then the spiritual remains true to its own elemental laws. We can say that with suprasensory consciousness, the human soul awakens in the spiritual world. But we must also say that through love, the spirit awakens in the sensory world. Wherever love and compassion are active in life, we can perceive the magic breath of the spirit blowing through the sensory world. Therefore, when properly developed, clairvoyance never blunts love and compassion. The more the soul becomes properly accustomed to the spiritual worlds, the more it will feel lovelessness and the lack of empathy and compassion as a denial of the spirit itself. The experiences of a consciousness on its way to clairvoyance demonstrate quite particular characteristics. The I feeling required for experience in the suprasensory worlds is easily muted. Often it is like a faint, guttering out memory. At the same time, as soon as one enters the suprasensory world, feelings of hate or lovelessness, as well as immoral impulses, become strong soul experiences. They present themselves to the soul as accusations that have come alive. They become gruesomely real pictures. In order not to be tortured by those pictures, suprasensory consciousness often grasps after spiritual forces that can weaken their impressions. But these powers then permeate the soul with forces that can spoil the clairvoyance one has gained. They drive clairvoyance away from the good realms of the spiritual world and direct it toward the bad. On the other hand, genuine love and true kindness of the soul are experiences that strengthen consciousness, giving it the forces it needs to enter into clairvoyance. I said that we must prepare the soul before it can have suprasensory experiences. It must be added that a genuine capacity for love and a desire for true human kindness, compassion, and empathy are among the many means of such preparation. An excessive I feeling in the physical world works against morality. A weak I feeling means that the soul that is surrounded with storms of elemental sympathies and antipathies lacks inner certainty and stability. Inner certainty and stability can be present only when a sufficiently strong I feeling rises from experiences in the physical sensory world into the etheric body, even though the etheric body may remain unknown to us in normal life. To develop a genuinely moral attitude in our souls, we must mute the I feeling with tendencies to compassion and love.